The geopolitical landscape of Southern Africa is going through a seismic shift, one that has suddenly captured the urgent attention of major global capitals, especially London. The British government has now issued a diplomatic warning of rare clarity and seriousness, a message that stands out for how direct and uncompromising it is. This warning, aimed at South African President Cyril Ramaphosa and economic freedom fighters leader Julius Malema, marks a clear break from the usual quiet and carefully worded language of international diplomacy. It sends a strong signal that the United Kingdom no longer sees South Africa's political direction as just a domestic issue, but as something that could threaten regional stability and even the broader international economic order. The timing of this intervention is critical. It comes in the tense aftermath of the historic 2024 general election, an election that shattered the African National Congress's decades-long dominance and pushed the country into an uncertain era of coalition politics. For the first time in 30 years, the ANC failed to secure a parliamentary majority, creating a political vacuum that different factions and radical forces are now competing to fill. This transition has made Western powers increasingly uneasy, and their concerns are being expressed with a bluntness not seen since the end of apartheid. Diplomats in both Pretoria and London have described the current stance of the UK Foreign Office as one of deepening alarm. They point to a dangerous convergence of destabilizing factors that could undermine Africa's most industrialized economy. These include the drawn-out and often unclear coalition negotiations, a visible rise in political volatility, and a surge in aggressive rhetoric from senior political figures. Many of these leaders are promoting policies that the international community sees as openly hostile to private property and the rule of law. The British warning, delivered through high-level diplomatic channels and reinforced at a key press conference in London, reflects a growing belief among analysts that South Africa may be approaching a serious democratic setback. For the UK, this is not just about political principles. Britain has multi-billion-pound trade and investment interests tied to South Africa, and the idea of a government shaped by radical populist ideologies is viewed as a direct threat to the economic security of British-owned companies operating in the country. At the heart of British concerns are recent public statements from South African leaders that appear to single out UK-based corporations and call for aggressive state control over the economy. These declarations have raised doubts about long-standing legal protections that once made South Africa a reliable destination for foreign investment. The 2024 election results intensified this anxiety, because the ANC's loss of dominance has made a potential alliance with the EFF a realistic option for some factions within the party, even though such a coalition is seen by global markets as a worst-case scenario. Internationally, the EFF is known for its radical agenda, which includes land expropriation without compensation and the full nationalization of mines, banks, and other key industries. The British government has stated clearly that any real movement toward these policies would trigger a major reassessment of relations between the two countries. This could mean the withdrawal of diplomatic support and a sharp reduction in trade cooperation, signaling just how high the stakes have become. A spokesperson for the UK Foreign Office, speaking with a level of directness that stunned many in diplomatic circles, stated that London is closely and continuously monitoring every signal coming out of Pretoria. The spokesperson warned that any actions by a new coalition government that weaken the rule of law or shake the confidence of global investors would cause lasting and possibly irreversible damage to South Africa's international reputation. This unusually blunt language suggests that the UK believes the Rainbow Nation is approaching a critical turning point, where the choice between short-term populist politics and long-term constitutional stability could define the country's future for an entire generation. This outside pressure is landing at a moment when President Ramaphosa is already under heavy internal strain. Within his own party, he faces a deeply divided leadership. Some members still support a centrist, market-friendly path, while others are increasingly drawn to the populist appeal of the EFF's message of economic emancipation. The president's apparent reluctance to firmly reject the most radical of these proposals has fueled accusations of political weakness. Critics argue that his silence is being read internationally as a quiet acceptance of a more extreme direction for South Africa. In a hurried attempt to limit the damage and calm a nervous South African rand, President Ramaphosa has tried to project an image of stability and continuity through a series of public statements and urgent telephone calls with international partners. He has reaffirmed South Africa's commitment to the constitutional principles that have guided the country since 1994. He has insisted that the nation remains open for business and that any future coalition government will operate strictly within the existing legal framework. Yet these reassurances have struggled to compete with the far more emotional and confrontational messaging coming from Julius Malema. The EFF leader, known for his rhetorical force and his ability to energize young voters, responded to the British warning with his trademark defiance. Speaking to a massive crowd in Johannesburg, Malema dismissed the UK's concerns as nothing more than a form of neo-colonial arrogance. He declared that South Africa is a sovereign nation and will not take orders from former colonial powers. His statement that British companies should simply leave if they are unwilling to operate under new conditions sent shockwaves through financial markets and made Ramaphosa's efforts to reassure investors even more difficult. The effects of this political and rhetorical clash were immediate and visible. Global markets, which depend on stability and predictability, reacted by selling off South African assets. The rand's wild swings against the dollar, pound, and euro have become a real-time indicator of how likely investors believe an ANC-EFF coalition might be. Beyond the currency, major multinational companies in mining and manufacturing, sectors that support millions of jobs, have reportedly begun freezing or delaying investment plans while they wait for clarity on whether their property rights will be protected. Diplomatic sources say that even if the EFF's most extreme policies are never fully enacted, simply having such figures close to power creates a risk premium that South Africa cannot afford. The country is already dealing with slow economic growth, a failing energy system, and one of the highest unemployment rates on the planet. In this fragile environment, losing foreign direct investment would not just hurt economic statistics. It could become a social disaster, one capable of triggering widespread unrest and deepening inequality. And this growing sense of anxiety is not limited to London alone. While the UK has spoken the loudest, similar warnings are now being quietly echoed in Brussels and Washington as well. The United States State Department is also closely watching the evolving coalition talks, with a particular focus on how South Africa's foreign policy could shift under a more radical government. At the same time, major international financial institutions, including the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, have signaled that any future support will depend heavily on the country maintaining sound economic policies and protecting the independence of its judiciary. South Africa is now increasingly being viewed as strategically vulnerable, with its long-standing role as a stabilizing anchor in sub-Saharan Africa under real threat. If South Africa were to stumble, the consequences would likely ripple across the continent, weakening neighboring economies and complicating global efforts to support African development. Inside the country, business leaders and civil society groups have added their voices to the growing wave of concern. Many are urging President Ramaphosa to take a moderate and cautious path. The South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry, SOCI, has been especially outspoken, warning that the nation is standing at a crossroads. One direction leads toward economic integration, investor confidence, and growth, while the other leads toward isolation, capital flight, and long-term decline. They have called for calm, responsible leadership that focuses on the future of the economy rather than short-term political calculations. Even respected veterans of the anti-apartheid movement, figures who once stood firmly alongside the ANC's current leadership, have stepped forward with public appeals. They are urging the party to defend the constitutional settlement of 1994, which was meant to guarantee an inclusive and democratic future. These elder statesmen argue that the EFF's vision represents a betrayal of those ideals, and that entering a coalition with such a movement would amount to an admission of both moral failure and political desperation. As the deadline for forming a new government draws closer, the pressure on Ramaphosa is intensifying from every possible direction. He now finds himself trapped in a pincer movement between two powerful forces. On one side is a frustrated and impoverished domestic population demanding bold and radical change. On the other is an international community demanding stability, predictability, and the protection of investment and property rights. The choices he makes in the coming days will define not only his political career, but his entire historical legacy. If he moves toward a coalition that empowers the EFF, he risks a near-total collapse in relations with Western nations and the possibility of a prolonged economic downturn. But if he chooses a more centrist route, perhaps by aligning with the Democratic Alliance or other moderate parties, he risks being branded a sellout by populist factions. That path could trigger deeper divisions within the ANC itself and usher in a period of intense internal conflict. The stakes could hardly be higher. The outcome of this moment will determine whether South Africa continues to stand as a symbol of successful democratic transition, or whether it becomes a warning story of post-colonial decline. For now, the world's attention remains fixed on Pretoria, waiting for any clear sign of which direction the country will ultimately take. The UK's unusually blunt diplomatic warning has already drawn clear lines in the sand, but in the end, the real power rests with the South African people and the leaders they choose to follow. The balance between political survival and responsible governance has never been more fragile. Any misstep during this highly sensitive period could come at a heavy cost to South Africa's reputation as a trustworthy and reliable global partner. For now, the mood remains one of cautious tension, as the international community prepares for every possible outcome, fully aware that the decisions being made today will echo for decades, shaping not only the lives of South African citizens but also the country's standing within the global order. The economic consequences of this political drama go far beyond simple trade statistics. They strike at the very survival of the South African middle class and the future of millions who already live in poverty. Without a consistent flow of foreign investment, the government's ability to fund social welfare programs, maintain infrastructure, and deliver basic public services would be severely weakened. Analysts warn that a more radical South Africa could find itself increasingly cut off, not just from Western partners, but from the global financial system as a whole. This isolation would make borrowing far more expensive and push inflation to levels that could destroy the purchasing power of ordinary citizens. In this scenario, the freedom promised by radical populism may instead produce a new kind of economic suffering, defined by shortages, instability, and long-term systemic decline. At the same time, the country's legal and institutional foundations, once seen as a model for emerging markets, are now under direct threat. The independence of the South African Reserve Bank and the neutrality of the courts represent the final lines of defense against the kind of state capture and entrenched corruption that have devastated other nations in the region. International observers fear that a coalition government influenced by radical forces could attempt to fill these institutions with loyalists, effectively stripping away the checks and balances that prevent authoritarian rule. The British warning served as a clear signal that South Africa is valued not only for its natural resources, but for the strength of its institutions. If those institutions collapse, global confidence in the country is likely to collapse with them. The current standoff involving Ramaphosa, Malema, and the United Kingdom reflects a much deeper struggle over the future direction of the South African state. It represents a clash between two fundamentally opposing visions. One sees South Africa as a modern nation integrated into the global economy, built on stability, law, and cooperation. The other imagines a revolutionary state determined to overturn the existing system in the name of radical transformation. As negotiations reach their most critical phase, the tension is no longer confined to Parliament in Cape Town or government offices in Pretoria. It is felt in boardrooms, trading floors, and marketplaces around the world, wherever there is a stake in South Africa's future. The road ahead is narrow, dangerous, and filled with uncertainty, and the margin for error is now almost non-existent.